Let's get started.
Thanks, Manu. So the title is Multilevel Bayesian Methods for Water and Climate Prediction. The way I want to present this talk is first introduce the age-old water prediction problem from a water management and hydro systems prediction context. How can one think of reservoir when you're looking at water supply into the system? And then potentially a direction towards solving some of those hydrologic droughts and floods issues could be in this idea of paleo stream flow reconstruction. So I'll introduce a little bit about paleohydrology and what that means for water predictions for a reservoir or a large water system. And then as you're thinking of these things, the paleohydrology context generally, you will encounter several statistical issues or numerical issues that you might get as you're building up these regression models. So the idea from there is, are there methods within the Bayesian thinking that we can use to solve some of those or address some of those issues, and then have a much more seamless or elegant or simultaneous ways of fitting these models, all using one framework. And then a little bit of what is the role of demand, and if such big droughts were to happen today, how should one think about this and stuff like that. I'll give two examples. One of the examples is from New York City case study. So that is a slightly different context from where you are here in the setup, much more humid place. And there the idea is that all these stream flow gauges or the reservoirs, they are mostly in parallel. So the network structure is existing, but they're completely independent in terms of like modeling these things. So that's almost like a statistical way of thinking how to structure those. The second example is the upper Missouri Basin, much more in the west. Here, the river network structure is much more clear. And there's another Bayesian network way of thinking about these things using a spatial Markovian approach. That would be the second example. So the first example would be reservoirs in parallel. The second example, you could think of it as reservoirs if you have them in series. In both the cases, you have ways of constructing Bayesian frameworks to solve these problems. Okay, so with that, I will start with the basic context. I don't need to preach the hydro systems choir that it is important to think about risks to the reservoir systems in a dynamic context. These things switch or change over time and space. The way they manifest is they are manifesting as regimes of hydrology. So you may have years of dry conditions and you may have years of wet conditions. So as a reservoir manager or a reservoir systems operator or a systems engineer, what you have to think about is how can we ensure reliable water supply? In other words, how can we quantify those risks of droughts and floods? The idea is, can we have improved knowledge or better or advanced knowledge of the future water supplies? If we have them, then what we can do with them is we have a much more reliable water for the system. We can improve the water policy for the future because most of the policies have been developed much past in the time. We can develop management strategies on a near-term operational context, and one can think of long-term infrastructure planning also. If you have to redesign it or build a new dam for 50 to 100 years, what time series you need for those things. That's sort of the framing. I'll give you a little bit more deeper understanding of the example. So the example case that I'm introducing here, and I'll use it to solve this problem later on, is from New York City water system. So the map you see here on the left, this is the actual watersheds for New York City water supply. So we have two major systems, the Catskill Delaware watershed, which supplies 90% of the water to the city. The city is somewhere here. The dams are up like 200 miles away. So the water is collected there, very little water quality cleaning and stuff, and then you bring it through the aqueducts all the way to the city, as much as pressurized system in the sense that up to the 6th floor, you don't need to pump it. Right? So it's that efficient. And there is this backup system, which is about 10% of the water that comes from the Croton system. Typically, when there are issues with these tunnels, if they get shut down, then they use the Croton system, or if you are going through a drought, then they use it as a backup system. If you step back, I think it is a much more complex system because the reservoirs are all mostly owned by the city government, and they have an operating rule that is always thinking about securing themselves for the drought. And unlike reservoirs in the West, these reservoirs are only 1-year systems. So you want to look at refill every year. So by the time you start your summer time, you have to have all these reservoirs full. So then the people in the downstream, so the stakeholders in the downstream, they are always worried about not getting enough water throughout the season. There is an ecological health issue there. The fishes are federally endangered species, so you need enough water, cold water from the dams. So they're always asking for more water. The upstream, the city would try to not release enough water because they are trying to secure themselves for the droughts. So you can see already a competing stakeholder issue here. When they release the water, they're releasing it in the off season. So what happens is it becomes a flooding issue, the downstream floods, because they are not keep releasing the water constantly over time. So then this is a thinking, like an optimization thinking problem. What's the best way to do this? Then if you think of the actual problems that the city is looking at, they don't have enough time series to actually understand this risk properly. The longest goes back to 100 years, but that's just one station in that entire catchment. Every other station is about 50 to 60 years. So if you're looking at a century scale drought, you really don't have a signal in the time series that you're trying to observe from that. Another big issue is the 1960s drought of the record, the one that you see here. This is where the city in the known history has experienced a drought of the record. They call it the 1960s drought of the century. At that time, the reservoirs were mostly empty. Now, if something like that were to happen today with today's population demands and 9 to 10 million people, we don't have enough water. That's the message, right? So we had a very recent drought in the past 1 month. No rainfall for a few weeks triggered a drought, and the reservoirs almost came to 50%, 60% full. And that already triggered this drought, and we were asked to do conservation measures. So you can see a small deficit itself can trigger a drought, but if a drought like 1960s happens again, then it's a much more catastrophic issue. So the question is, what is the probability of such a drought happening again? Do we have something like that in the past so that they can plan for that for the future? Okay, so I'll give you a little bit more deeper dive into the one station that has 100 years. So this is from the Schoharie Creek. It is one of the major water supply catchments for the city. It's one of the major reservoirs. And you have 100 years of flow, annual flow here. And what is interesting is in the more recent times, you have slightly higher variance compared to the past. And the 1960s is what you can see here. Much more deeper drought, but also long span drought. So it's almost like for a decade. So that is on the annual time scale. So if you look at the decadal averages, every decade you take the average flows and look at what happens. And what you're seeing here is that the first 3-4 decades, the flow has been going down, followed by it recovered back into the normal conditions. And this is followed by this 1960s drought. And then you have this post-drought pluvial phase, which happens to be the highest pluvial phase in the post-drought phase. And then since then, it has normalized a little bit on a decadal time scale. But when you really think about it in a much bigger lens, which is take 50-year averages, now this plot is made with flows before the 1960s drought has started and flows after the 1960s drought has ended. And you can see that this was a drier phase over a 50-year time span, and this was a slightly wetter phase over a 50-year time span. So before the major drought and after the major drought, the flow statistics have been different also. Okay, so then the main question is that modern wet period, is that an outlier, or what we are seeing today in the current time, is that one of a event or one of the outlier when you put that in the context of much longer time series, or is the 1960s or the pre-1960s drought much more common? And the other question is, what is the probability that this 1960s drought will reappear? Or is that the only drought that was bad in the history, or were there droughts much worse than that drought? Okay, so the answer, more generally, the question is, how can water supply be understood in terms of historical and current variability patterns? So this question is for any water system. So what is the understanding of the system variability across, right? So then one of the answers or the potential solution could be in this field of paleohydrology. So the idea is that if you have long stream flow records, which may have the climate influence incorporated into them, which means you have a longer record, then we can understand these regime behaviors much better, and then we can plan the systems much better. So that's the paleo stream flow reconstruction idea. And the basis for that is if you look at a tree, if you look at the cross-section, this is the cross-section of the tree. And if you take a core out of it, what you'll see is this tree has rings. The rings represents the growth of the tree, the growth cycle of the tree. So it has two parts to it. The early wood and late wood is what they call it. The white colored thing you see is when it's a standard cycle. The late wood is the end of the year cycle. So together, when you add those, we call that a 1-year growth index. And this is a representation of what happened to that tree in that year. Now, the idea with this tree ring reconstructions is that it is an aggregator of precipitation and temperature, just like stream flow. So it is tending to correlate well with stream flow. So when you look at these annual ring indices, it better correlates with stream flow. So one can think of regressing this with stream flow and trying to understand this better in the past. So then the question is, if the stream flow reconstructions can be used as extended records in the past, there are a lot of issues with uncertainty, which I'll introduce in a minute. So what's the best way to capture those uncertainties and reduce those in this entire reconstruction model? And as you're doing this, if you think of one station only, that is one problem. But if you think of the entire water basin, you have multiple stream flow sites that you're trying to model. So there is this spatial characteristic you have to capture. And that characteristic could be like a spatial network behavior. The trees also may be very common across the station. So there is a common behavior of the trees on multiple sites. So that behavior should also be captured. A more broader context about stream flow reconstructions generally is there are dendrochronologists who do this trading coring and indexing. So what they do is they go into the mountains, they collect one of these, some trees which actually resonate well with moisture sensitivity, and they reflect the climatic conditions in those years. So as I was showing, this is the early wood, that's the late wood together is 1 year, and they start working backwards from the end of the tree, so year 1, year 2, year so on, until the beginning of the tree. The idea with this is they're not just doing it for one tree. They have a selected species, for example, and they take approximately 20 trees of the same kind to get an averaging process. Even for within the tree, they have about 20 cores, so not just one core per tree. So when you aggregate all of that, that's about 400 time series samples you're averaging. So it's an average behavior of the climate of that system. Okay, so then what is the rationale for Bayesian structuring or Bayesian thinking? Is that when you look at paleo reconstructions, this often involves multiple proxies. So you have different types of predictors or tree ring proxies that you want to use. You have multiple records, different streamflow sites you want to construct. There could be missing values both in the proxies and in the streamflow sites. So some streamflow sites are longer than the others. Same thing with the proxies. Some proxies are longer than the others. Some trees are older than the others, right? So that's the idea. It's really a high dimensional problem. So the dimensionality is there in X. If you think of regression problem as X informing Y, the dimensionality is also in Y. So then if that's the structure, how to best estimate the overall parameterization of this model, given you only have finite data set. Again, if you think about the stream flow, you only have limitations in terms of 50 to 60 years for the most part. And then you should also capture the across-site correlation and the common dependence. What is the best way to think about that? Should we use a spatial correlation matrix, or should we use a network behavior analysis for that? The answer for these questions lies in this idea of hierarchical Bayesian thinking, because these models allow for this multi-structuring or multi-levels that you can model things across, so that the entire uncertainty in all the parameters gets propagated into the model. Instead of doing it one step at a time and using the outputs from one model as inputs to the other, what you can do in the hierarchical structuring is that everything is structured in a mathematical process and you're estimating the parameters all at the same time. Then there is this benefit of something called partial pooling. So if you have differential sample sizes, aggregating them to some extent would increase the effective sample size. So that means your uncertainty estimates are much more tighter, it's better represented. Okay, so the two examples I'll give are the ones which are in parallel is coming from the New York City case, the Delaware River Basin, and the one which are the flows in series or the network structure is coming from the Upper Missouri River Basin. Okay, so the first example, this one is where we did 500 years, 5 centuries of streamflow, basin-wide streamflow for this catchment, and also the downstream, because you also have to understand what is a drought signal in the downstream so you can release enough water when there is that signal. What we did here is a Bayesian strategy that can handle different multiple tree ring proxies. The trees have missing information, they have differential lengths. We have different hydrologic records, some longer, some shorter, unequal data lengths, basically. And the flows also scale over the space. And what we did here is we used a drainage area scaling relationship in a multi-level framework. But these are not separate models. This is a mathematical structure that captures everything in one shot, and you can estimate the parameters together. Okay, so some data example is that the longest tree that we have in that basin goes back to 1450. So that's about 500 years of chronologies or X predictor records. And the earliest streamflow site is 1904, the one that we just saw. The latest is. So this is differential length on X and differential length on Y. And as I said, this is like approximation of 400 something time series samples. And the idea is that I'm using trading chronologies into a regression model with streamflow to come up with estimates of the past. But that regression model is a Bayesian hierarchical regression model. So that's a general mapping of where the flow sites are and where the trees are. So in the first shot, what we had was 27 stream flow gauges across this basin, covering all the reservoirs and all the stream flow sites. And then we had approximately 40 treating chronology sites. So the ones in the red are where the actual treating sites are. Again, when you say a chronology, it's a representation of the climate in that region. So what we did was a very simple predictor selection mechanism. And from the 40 trading chronologies, we were able to reduce it to 16 chronologies at the lag 0 time series. I'll talk about that in a minute. And approximately 6 chronologies or 6 time series, which have a lag 1 correlation. So that's a 22 predictors in a way. And the way we check that are a standard correlation hypothesis, variance inflation factor to make sure that the trees are not correlated within themselves, and the leverage issues in terms of if you have bad values, this will induce outliers in the prediction. So we had to check for leverage and remove the trees that had those bad values. Okay, so this is an example of the actual prediction. So this is all the PDF is bad. Anyway, so these are all the sites. These are the sites and these are the trees. So this is your correlation matrix, so to speak. And you can see there are some trees that are resonating across a lot of stations. So the way we tried this is every tree should have a statistically significant hypothesis at a 5% rejection level. So it should have a significant correlation with a streamflow site. But a treating chronology should also explain at least 21 sites of the 27. So that's approximately 77% of the basin. So the idea with this is not just taking one local tree only, but select the trees that have a common signal across the basin. So that's why we did that. And we did some other statistical tests of checking leverage and variance inflation factor. So what we found is that there are 16 chronologies that resonate at the lag 0 time series, which means that the flow in that current year can be informed by the trading chronology in that year. There are 6 chronologies that respond at lag 1. Some trees grow slowly, so they're responding slowly to the climate conditions. So what happens is the readings of the next year are being used to inform flows of the current year because the response in the trees is much later. So together you have 22 something predictors, and this is a basic idea of how the model is structured. Yeah, so very simple model of log normal flows. So log normal flows or log of the flows follows a normal distribution. There's a mean process and there's a variance to the process that is changing with the stations. The mean of the process can be informed by some intercept and some slope multiplied by the predictor. Standard regression setup. But what is the addition here is that we also treat the predictors as a stochastic node. So in this case, what happens is you can handle missing values in the predictors. So instead of treating them as observations, we treat them as a stochastic node. And then those observations they have a mean and a variance, which you estimate as part of the model. Now, the multi-level comes in here is that each of these intercepts and slopes have another regression model behind it, which we call the multi-level framing, is that those intercepts and the slopes also have a common distribution. We assume a normal distribution in this case, and they have a mean and a variance, and that mean is informed by some kind of a drainage area scaling. So if you think of it, a larger drainage area will have a higher mean value. A smaller drainage area will have a smaller mean value in terms of flow. So that is being captured here. So this is your scaling relationship. Similar model is set up for the coefficients. And the idea with this is that if there are some streams, some trading chronologies that respond across the basin, that scaling will be captured in that multi-level model. And then there are all the parameters that are there within the model. We have and uninformative prior is what we call. So initial conditions, they're all uninformative. And then we solve this using a Bayesian setup. So all the parameters are estimated using a Bayesian estimation approach. So basically, this standard statistical stuff. So the parameters given the data, you can invert that based on data given parameters, and you have some prior distribution on that. Okay, so the outputs are the following. The model basically fits rings to the flow relationships over the actual instrumental period, 1900 to 2022. It's a simultaneous Markov chain Monte Carlo approach, where you're trying to estimate all the parameters in this mathematical framework once in one shot. The thing with this is it uses as many trees as you go back in time. So if you have more predictors in a given year, you have less uncertainty. If you have less predictors in a given year, because as you go back in time, some trees are only longer. So then you'd have more uncertainty in that. So uncertainty is actually varying with time. The outcomes are we have approximately 3,000 traces of a 500-year streamflow sequence. So the 500-year annual streamflow sequence is what is being predicted. But because you're doing a Monte Carlo simulation, you can get as many traces as you want. And 3,000 seems to be the optimal in this case. And like I said, scaling is captured using this drainage area scaling relationship. Okay, so this is one example of the reconstructions, how they look like. This is an example for the West Branch Delaware River. It's one of the major tributaries. And so there's a lot going on in this figure. I'll try to walk you through. X-axis is water year presented. Y-axis is the annual average flow. And we have the gray band, which is the uncertainty bounds from the model. We have the black line, which is the median. This line here, reference, is the median of the observed flows, just to see whether you are above mean or below mean. The green line that you see here on the secondary y-axis, this is telling us how many predictors are there as you go back in time. So during certain period, 1800s to the early 2000s, you had 22 something predictors. But as you go back in time, some trees drop off because they don't have information. The longest one goes back up to 1450. See, they drop off all the way up to 1. And what you can observe is when you have more predictors, the uncertainties are much more tighter, the intervals are much more tighter, better captured. And when the predictors are dropping off, when you have less predictors, you can see the uncertainties grow over time. So it automatically captures differential uncertainty levels also. And the blue dots that you see there at this time frame, these are the actual observations to see how well the model is fitting the observations. And these red dashed lines are the maximum flow you have seen in the instrumental period and the minimum flow you have seen in the instrumental period. So one question is, do we have flows greater than the maximum flow in the instrumental period? If you capture the uncertainty bounds, there are phases where that exceeds. Do we have flows less than the minimum, the 1960s flow? And if you capture the uncertainties, you can see there are some years that might actually catch those. A little bit on the drought, I'll come back to later. So the 1960s drought post-pluvial, there seems to be a similar whiplash event that happened in the 1800s. But more often, what you'll see is that these are longer droughts that you are seeing here, which may not be seen in the observational period. Okay, some more statistics on how well the model is doing. So we were comparing observed flows with the predicted flows. X-axis is the predictions, y-axis is the observations, and the one-to-one line. A good prediction model tends to be closer to the one-to-one line. And most all of them are unbiased with fairly well-developed R-squares or good correlations between observed and predicted. These are 9 different sites across the 27. That's one example of like a blown-up shown there. Okay, so this is a plot of explained variance. So you would typically expect for trading reconstructions approximately 30 to 50% explained variance, sometimes up to 60%. But what we are seeing here is that there are some stations that where the explained variance is at least more than 60%. And interestingly, these are the actual major contributors to the basin. So the water supply is coming from those. So the confidence of using this for reservoir operations is pretty high. The plot here in the bottom, this shows the bias of the predictions. And what you're seeing here is that the median of the predicted bias is approximately 0 plus minus 10%, but most all of them are within 5%. So it's an unbiased prediction is what you're basically seeing here. And the area scaling is captured here. So on the x-axis, you have log drainage area. On the y-axis, you have the model intercepts. So this is typically your log scaling of the areas that you're seeing. And the model captures those well with reasonable uncertainty bands around it. What you see on the right side is one example of a tree chronology, which is also responding to drainage areas. So stations with larger drainage area, this has a bigger coefficient or bigger effect. Stations with smaller drainage area, this has a smaller effect. Not all trees are responding like this, but there are some trees which are responding as a scaling coefficient. Okay, so then we did some drought analysis to basically answer what were those questions. So how can we answer those questions? So what we did is this decadal drought analysis to see if 1960s drought is really the worst drought or not. Again, a lot going on here. So there is one plot here, one plot here. So x-axis is time again, but now each one is a decade, so 10 years averages. Y-axis in this case is the decadal average. So the blue dots you see here are the observed decadal averages. The box that you see here, these are the distributions of the entire 3,000 traces. So you take every trace, get the decadal averages, and then you plot across all the traces. That's the box. So the idea with this is, if you think about this, 1960s, this is a representation of the 1960s drought, and the model captures that well. Post 1960s pluvial, the model captures that well. Now, what's the probability of something like a 1960s drought to happen is that if you count the number of values that are less than this line, this orange line that you see here, that's the 1960s decadal drought. This is the 67th percentile, an index of wet spell. This is the 33rd percentile, an index of a nominal drought. So two questions we try to answer here are, what's the chance that you might see a 1960s type of a drought? And what's the chance that you might see a normal drought, which is like a 33rd percentile? So if your decadal average is lower than the annual 33rd percentile, you can define that as a drought. And you do some calculations here. Now, if you only take the instrumental period, that's about 1 in 55 decades something. If you take the longer span, you have 1840s, which is actually much worse than the 1960s drought. So that's now, if you put the whole thing in perspective, that is 2 in 50-something events. So from a 2% chance of this 1960s drought, you have doubled that risk, right? So it's now a 4% chance of that risk. If you actually put the 33rd percentile, a slightly lower threshold for the drought, then you see many more such events happening in the past. There are 7 or 8 decades here out of the 50 decades that you see. So that's about a 14 to 15% chance of that. Okay, so then we did this for the whole basin just to see how the other stations are responding. The top plot here is stations on the x-axis. Again, the figure is distorted, and this axis is the decades. And if you see the color is the actual probability of that estimate. So the idea with this is, are only some stations responding to the drought, or is the entire basin responding to the drought, right? So the bottom plot is the nominal drought. This is the 33rd percentile. Many more stations are actually seeing that drought. But when you look at the 1960s drought, which is the deepest drought, not all stations are resonating like that. And you can see some of them have a recurrence of those things happening. So some stations are much more critical than the other stations. And some of these are actually the major water supply reservoir stations. So it's much more important to attract those things better. So it's interesting that some stations have nominal drought, the entire basin is responding, but much deeper droughts, there are pockets or clusters of what is happening. So where are these stations? How can you factor them into the operations becomes important. Okay, so the last plot on the drought is, the first question is, if such a drought were to occur now with today's demand, what would the stress be, right? So that's the question here. Again, this is the flows of 3 major reservoirs. From that, we approximately get about 600 million gallons of water today's time. But the city is entitled to 800 million gallons. They can actually take 800 million gallons if they want, but typically we extract 600 million gallons on average. So what we did here is a deficit accounting mechanism. It's a proxy for storage, so to speak. So there is a demand, which is every year, how much water can you take? And there is supply coming from these reconstructed stream flows. And if the demand is greater than supply, then you have a deficit. And if this happens many more times over time, the deficit keeps accumulating. So you're integrating the deficits as much as how high it can go, how severe it can get, when will it recover, and what is the span of the drought. So the 1960s, again, you can see this happened. This line you see this is the storage limit. So reservoir limit, basically. And you'd think that the 1960s was bad, but something like that behavior happened here, here, here. More than 2 times, right? So if you put demand in perspective. Now, what is worse is the 1800s behavior. So this is a deep, not that deep drought, but long drought. But if you're accumulating all the deficit over 20, 30 years, then you can see the reservoir had dried up on today's demand, and it hasn't recovered until like 30, 40 years. So a situation like this would be much worse because the storage systems are not prepared for these. So it's an important thing to consider, and this is just like an aggregation of all the ensembles into it. So as you increase the water demand, what would be that critical demand ratio that you want to keep so that you have some nominal probability of failure? So y-axis is what's the chance of a drought greater than 1 year and the storage greater than 100 billion gallons, which is approximately the nominal drought alert level. So as you can see, for 600 million gallons, it's about 20% chance of that happening. But if the city were to actually take 800 million gallons, the probability of the reservoir drying up more than a year is approximately 60%. So it gives you some sense of the nonlinear scaling of the demand. What would be the ideal demand ratio you want to pick? Okay, so the takeaways are that now the city has 5 centuries of basin-wide flows. They can use it into their operations model. So they have their own model called OST. So they have to disaggregate this into a daily time scale, run it through their storage and everything. So, but now they're using this for their operations. And the Bayesian strategy helped address all those issues of the statistical nature. And then we now have everything scaled in one shot. One observation is the 1960s drought is not the only anomaly. We were seeing that in the 1840s. But if you put today's demand in context, 1960s drought is not the only problem. You have much bigger problems than that, is what you have to see here. Okay, so the second example is what if the flows are in a network? So this one is from the upper Missouri Basin, but the basic theory is the following. If the dams are in series and the trees have some common structure across, so you can think of a conceptual diagram like this. So there is a downstream flow. There are some upstream flows that are informing the downstream flows. As you go back, you can see some trees are there informing those flows. So you have trees informing stations and the stations also informing stations, right? So there is some kind of a network topology that you want to capture here. So that network structure would now inform how you are reconstructing the model or how we are setting up the mathematical framework. The two ways of predictors here are the downstream flows will get information from immediate upstream flows. So one level Markovian, like time Markov process. This is a spatial Markovian process. The other predictors are the standard tree ring chronology. So there are more information coming, one from the trees, but one from also the site. So in this case, you'll have better uncertainty reduction because you're capturing the network structure. You're preserving the mass using this mass balance approach. Okay, so framing would be something like this. If you have this cartoon you're seeing here, it's a digraph or a network idea. So A is getting information from B and C, but it can also get some local trees. And then each of those Bs and Cs can have its own trees. But in this case, for example, C is now getting information from 3 sites upstream. So C has D, E, and F, and each one of them may have their own predictors. So each of the streamflow sites can have either an immediate upstream site as a predictor and the trees around that location as a predictor. And now you can set this up as sequential regression. But again, you're not solving one regression at a time. You're setting up the mathematical framework, and then you're solving everything using one estimation approach, the Bayesian estimation approach. So the properties of this, so we call this spatial Bayesian Markov because like time Markovian process, this is spatially Markovian because immediate sites are informing the next ones. The properties are that this exploits the network structure of the basin. It captures the physics accurately. It captures the mass balance properly. Then it actually captures the spatially consistent multi-sites. So you do not need a spatial covariance matrix to capture the correlations in Y. The network structure will capture the covariance for you. Then it uses both the information from streamflows and the tree sites. It maintains space-time correlation structures. It reduces uncertainties better, especially when you have more flows that are informing the flows. And like I said, there is no need of now trying to set up a large correlation matrix to solve for, because as the dimensionality increases, the correlation matrix solutions are very difficult. In this case, the network structure will take care of that for you. Okay, so in this example, what we tried to do was we take the actual physical network, the dendro network of this, we translate that into a digraph, something like this. So a river network structure along with its trees and predictors gets translated into a graphic like this, and now this is informing your model. And each of these links are set up using a regression equation, and the parameters of all those regressions are solved in one shot. Some results, there are one site which is approximately 40% explained variance, and there are two sites where you have 60% explained variance. And the difference is the following. This one does not have any upstream gauges. It is only coming from the trees. And this one has the trees and the upstream gauges. So you can immediately notice that here the uncertainty intervals of the predictions are much wider because it's only getting information from the trees. Whereas here, because you're also getting information from immediate upstream sites and the mass balance is preserved and all of that. So you can see the uncertainty bands are much more reduced. This is an example where it has much more multi-decadal signals. That's what you're basically capturing in these cycles. This is the observation, and these are the predictions. Another site which has upstream sites. So again, the uncertainties are much better captured. So it does the standard time series prediction, but it also reduces uncertainties well, and the correlations across all these sites can be preserved. I'll show one example of that. So on the left side, you have how much uncertainty reduction you'll get if you compare this with a standard regression approach. The dendrochronologists use something called a principal components regression. So you take this X matrix, reduce the dimension, and then send that into a regression approach. You have the Y matrix, reduce the dimension. It's a canonical regression. So that's the standard procedure. And we compare the uncertainty intervals of that model with the uncertainty intervals of our model. How much of that reduction can you get if you compare with the other model? And what's interesting is this: if you're off the network where only information is coming from trees, then the uncertainty reduction is approximately 5% plus or minus, which means that if you don't have flows informing flows, it is as good as any other standard regression because it's done using a Bayesian framework, but still a regression approach. But every point here which has flows informing flows, there the reduction in uncertainties is up to 50%, so that you're getting much more reduction in the uncertainties. And the reason here is that you have flows are also informing flows, more predictors, but the mass balance is preserved, so you have much more reduction in that uncertainty. The one in the right is the correlation. So in the first case, the gray dots are the standard model that had a covariance matrix you had to estimate, 18 by 18 covariance structure. The second model did not have any covariance matrix, computationally much faster. It was able to capture the entire correlation well. X-axis is the observed correlation between the flows, so 18 by 18 correlation matrix. Y-axis is the predicted median correlation of the flows. So even without a large covariance matrix, you're able to capture the covariance there. Okay, so the takeaways from this is that the BSM, or the Bayesian spatial Markov, this enables reconstructions at multiple gauges. It accounts for the network topology. The spatial dependence across the network is captured. We do not need a large covariance matrix to propagate those. And the uncertainties, as the standard Bayesian model, are propagated well. It is basically, if you think of this, it's a compact mathematical representation of the stochastic process, which is induced by the river network, and the trees, how they're behaving with the flows. Okay, with this slide, I will stop. So the summary is that first point, paleo reconstructions are a good direction. These are potentially useful to provide information on the wet and the dry periods. So you can capture the regimes better. What's the severity of the drought? What's the duration of the drought? Are there information which is not seen in the 20th century or beyond the instrumental period? And what we are seeing is that this statistical thinking, or the Bayesian statistical thinking, is much better or efficient in handling all these dimensionality issues, including large spatial networks, multiple proxies, missing information. How do you have unequal lengths, the spatial correlation structures, and uncertainty propagation. Again, these are statistical models, but restructuring of how you think so that you don't need to do separate regressions. You're doing it all in one shot. Then the real applications of those are, this is one part of the story. The second part is we have to take these reconstructions and put them in the context of water supply and demand. As I was showing, if you actually take today's water demand and put the past droughts in the context, At least in the Northeast, you don't have the water systems ready for that. In the West, you have a much bigger reservoir system, so the storage may be able to capture that. But you can get a signal of what are those failure statistics better. So what can the reservoir handle those things or not? So that structuring can be there also. Now, if you want to adopt this for the future, paleoclimate has information of the past. The non-stationarity signal may not be well captured because most of these trees are cleared of the non-stationary signal. The flows are also like pristine in the sense that they are not human modified. So how can you think of this for a future climate would be what information we can take from the past, use that for the future. So variability will continue in the future. So on top of that, if you add the trend behavior of that, so you have the trends and the variability captured together in one place. I will stop with that. Thanks very much for the invite.
Can I be, sorry. I wanted to thank you. Thanks a lot. My name is Giuseppe Mascaro. I want to mention that this seminar is co-hosted. You know, it was hosted by the Water and Climate Seminar Series, right? And also we are guests today at the Hydro Systems Seminar Series. And so, if you don't mind, I'm going to run the show now for the questions. In our seminar, we have this requirement for the students that they will read a paper that the seminar, the speaker sent them in advance and they submitted questions in advance. So perhaps now you're going to hear a couple of questions that the students have submitted reading the papers. So perhaps there might be some details that wasn't in the talk. And, you know, Naresh, thanks a lot. The seminar, the talk was great. Can Giz prepare us some information also related to the papers?
Sounds good. Yeah.